Hi, everybody. Welcome to our Cultural Connection speaker series, where we are talking with Americans in different fields of work who share their interest and knowledge in Russian art, society, culture, and history. We'll be seeing how American attitudes and tastes have changed over the years and how Americans are connecting on a cultural level with Russia. My name is Michael Beckelhimer, and I'm joining you from Washington, D.C. This program is presented by the Washington-based Forum for Cultural Engagement in coordination with the American Center of Moscow, which is supported by the American Embassy in Moscow. For those of you on the American Center's YouTube, VK, or Telegram channels, please post your comments when you're ready in the chat, and I'll get them as they come in. And also, you can select closed captioning in Russian if you'd like to follow along with closed captioning subtitles. Okay, let's get started. Our guest today is Michael Kunichika, a professor at Amherst College in Massachusetts. Our topic is teaching Russian culture and new ways of approaching Pushkin. I think it's appropriate that the first in our culture series starts with Pushkin. A little bit about Michael Kunichika. He came to the study of Russian originally because of a requirement at his undergraduate college. He went to Reed College in Oregon to study either a foreign language or math. Knowing math would be a disaster, he chose Russian on the advice of a friend, thinking he would study Russian just for a year, and then he would go on to become an English major. 25 years later, Russia and Russian have become his intellectual home. He teaches all periods of Russian literature and cinema, as well as Russian language, at Amherst, where he also served as the director of the Amherst Center for Russian Culture. In that role, he has sought to put Russian culture at the center of a range of topics animating American college campuses today. Also, he's written about the creation of antiquity during the modernist period in Russia, and he is currently writing a book about the interest in prehistory in the Soviet Union in the 1960s and 1970s. So, Michael, welcome to the series, and thank you for being here.
Thanks very much for having me.
I completely understand your desire to choose Russian over math. Not that Russian is easy, but I think math is worse. But to get started, to get to know you a little better, can you tell us about your first experiences in Russia? When did you first go? Where have you been? Where do you spend the most time when you go there? What is it about Russia that you connect with?
So I first went to Russia as part of a summer intensive Russian language program in 1997, which was with a program called ACTR, and we studied at Herzen University in St. Petersburg. It was my very first time in Russia, having only really taken 2 years of Russian by that point, and then reading Gogol and Bieli and Dostoevsky. So it was one of those very classic encounters with Petersburg. But after that, I've been to sort of less to the sort of capitals and more to various kinds of provincial cities or far-flung regions. So I did another intensive summer program in Tver. And then maybe the biggest one was a trip to the White Baltic Sea Canal, and then up to the White Baltic Sea, and then up to Solovki. And then I'm hoping to go to the republics at other points, for my other projects, the former republics.
Okay, so you've been to Solovki, and it sounds like we're going to be talking about the Gulag a little bit today. Yeah. That's fascinating. And it's probably welcome news that you haven't spent all of your time in Moscow and St. Petersburg, because getting out into the provinces is so fascinating, and it's so different. What was Tver like?
Well, Tver was it was an extraordinary, like a lot of summer programs, it was incredibly intense, both with just the kind of the differences between basically where I came from, which is I grew up in Honolulu, Hawaii, and ended up in Tver with another bunch of misfits trying to study Russian. It was an incredible program because they also took us into the countryside around Tver, where we spent a lot of time looking at old churches and this extraordinary landscapes. And yeah, you really got to see a lot of, I think, the countryside that you normally wouldn't see. And it was a kind of, yeah, really unusual glimpse into really into a kind of Russian culture at that point, still really in the kind of transformation or transition out of the Soviet Union and then into this, yeah, into the Russia of today.
Yeah. How do your students find you? What brings them to study Russian?
Yeah, that's a complex question. Now, I mean, Amherst is an institution where at this point maybe 50% of the students are sort of, they come from different minorities, maybe even more than 50. Many of them are, I think about 20% are Pell Grant students, which means that the college has really changed demographically, both in terms of ethnicity and in terms of socioeconomic difference. And so the students that are in my classes today really represent this incredible array of cultures, of backgrounds, and so they find their way in kind of all manners. Some are obviously ethnically Russian or from families that have, let's say, Russian backgrounds, but others are just taking it because they're fascinated either by the great classics of Russian literature or also really by cinema and media studies. So they're really from just, yeah, I mean, it's sort of extraordinary how diverse the student body is. And as a result, they come for really different reasons.
Interesting. So your students are most of the courses then around literature, cinema, sort of the basics of Russian culture?
Yeah, so in my department, which is the Department of Russian, we teach certainly the classics of Russian literature, which remains extremely appealing to a lot of the students. So we teach courses on Nabokov and Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and Pushkin, and those remain, I think, remarkable draws to the students. But we also teach a range of classes in the history of art in Russia. So we teach classes on the Russian avant-garde, not necessarily in my department, but those are enormously interesting and popular. And then Russian film survey classes, where you get a lot of students who are really interested in the kind of the ways that Russian and Soviet cinema contributed to international cinema. So there's just a variety of interest.
Has the interest grown in recent years?
Yeah, it's interesting. We're seeing kind of steady interest in the culture courses, and then some challenges around the language courses in language. Although there's an uptick this year of students who are interested in studying Russian, but it tends to ebb and flow, and then there's always a theory about why that is.
Which is?
Well, it can be sort of the relationship between Russia and America at any given particular moment. It could be, well, the newest one is a kind of, we're trying to think about whether the challenges around the interest in the humanities and foreign languages generally seems to be, it's a very challenging time just for the humanities, I think, generally. And so we're trying to experiment and think, or first we're trying to think about what the pressures are, and then the different ways to engage students with an interest, I would say, not just in Russia, but really in the world. And a lot of the foreign language departments are really spending quite a bit of time to innovate and to create new courses and ways of thinking about engaging, let's say, a new generation who were trying to kind of foster interest really in the world kind of generally, and then Russia sort of specifically.
How important? I think it's interesting that you said that the demographics of your college have changed so much. How important is it, or how much more important is it for college students at Amherst to choose a path that will lead to a real job that will help them work? And how does Russian play into that? You know, when I was a Russian studies major, you know, here in Washington, there were opportunities, but in general, people would perceive that as, why study Russian? What are you going to do with that?
Yeah, that is sort of the central question that we are facing, and if I had a perfect answer, then I think we would solve some of the challenges about. But what has been really important is trying to figure out how. So there is a basic question about whether a shifting demographic has different needs or interests of what they want out of a college education. And I think one of the standard views is that this is a time in which you're seeing many more wanting to go either into the STEM fields or into things like comp sci, fields that might seemingly promise a job right upon graduation.
Like sciences, economics.
So sciences and computer science and maybe those. But I think what we're also kind of trying to do is to explain again to a new generation why a study of something like Russian or German or French, why that could also have a range of possible both career possibilities. So entering the Foreign Service, becoming a journalist, etc., like entering even development or the World Bank, and all of the different ways that Russia could be paired, or you could study it by itself or have it paired with another sort of major. And so that a whole zone of the world or of history and culture could open to you. And certainly, and so those are all the kinds of ways that we're thinking about trying to make the study of Russian relevant or newly relevant to a new generation. And so, yeah, we are really spending a lot of time experimenting and thinking about new courses, new ways of offering the study of Russian, and trying to be really creative about the different kinds of offerings that we put together.
Well, speaking of courses, in a minute, I'm going to ask you about one of the courses you're teaching this spring semester about monuments, which I think sounds really fascinating and relevant. But I'd like to ask a few questions about Pushkin.
Yeah.
Since that is in the title of our talk today, and I have a particular love for Pushkin. When students come to Amherst and they're in your Russian language courses or in your literature courses, how do they approach? What do they know about Pushkin? How much do they know? How much do they care? And then how do you, as a professor, use Pushkin to explain Russia or to get people engaged in Russia?
Yeah, thanks so much for that question. I mean, I think they tend to know if there's names that they would know. It begins primarily with the great sort of novelistic tradition. So it's, there's obviously many who have heard about Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Nabokov. But one thing that we do is really, because we provide sort of survey courses and also just a range of special topic courses, like we really try to introduce them to Russia's poetic or tradition of Russian poetry. And so really from the get-go, we indicate to them or show them how central Pushkin has been, both to a wide array of histories, both of the development of Russian literature, but also how Pushkin, or the image of Pushkin, matters to different generations of Russians and and Soviet readers or cultural figures. So your film, for example, is a great sort of demonstration of all of the different ways that Pushkin has mattered. And in our particular case, one thing that we do is we do anything from teach specialized courses where students will read something like Medny Sadnik, or the Bronze Horseman, in the original, or Pushkin's short stories, or we will even have courses where they will read Eugene Onegin, Yevgeny Onegin, also in the original. And that's kind of a classic set of offerings. Something that I try to do is to think about the different images that Pushkin has, or how he has mattered to basically to the story of Russia and race. And so I teach a course about Russia and the representation of race, in which Pushkin is really central, because of the ways in which his own history, background, the story of his family has really intersected with certainly of Africa and his African heritage, but also how he has been really celebrated by a whole range of figures in America, often associated with the Harlem Renaissance.
Right. I think it seems to me very noticeable that as in the US, our colleges and our students and we in general have become more focused on race and more interested in these topics, that Pushkin has been, again, like in Russia, used for so many purposes. He's used here in America as an example of studying, or as a way to study race in Russia and in America as well. Can you, I mean, would you say that is that an aspect of Pushkin that really attracts your students' attention?
Yes. I think that I think that we see two things. One is that there are definitely a set that just absolutely think it's extraordinary to be reading him in Russian and find it incredibly satisfying. And that is always just a completely wonderful experience to be teaching it, to be teaching him. And then, but the other thing that is also incredibly compelling is to see how, and I think for a diverse student population, to see how a figure as central as Pushkin could be celebrated by a diversity of peoples. And so when figures from the Harlem Renaissance, for example, name a prize after Pushkin, the idea that he could have been so appealing to a previous generation of American or Black American writers is enormously, I think, intriguing for a range of students, and then becomes kind of an entry point to think really broadly about how so many Russian writers could be approached in this way, and how Russia and the Soviet Union as sort of multi-ethnic empires or states offer different ways of thinking about the status, or how we can think about race and ethnicity in different ways and like formations that offer both their own, I think, distinctive histories, but also a way of then reflecting back on the United States and its own history.
So when you all discuss and study Pushkin's ethnicity in Russia and Russian history, what are your insights into Russia and how Russians have understood Pushkin and his heritage? Like, what do you learn about Russia by doing that?
Yeah, it's a great question, because there are times where it matters and times where it doesn't, or it's, that his background is sort of, he can be seen from, let's say, the perspective of Dostoevsky as the universal human like type, a kind of quintessential Russian genius able to absorb, let's say, all cultures. And then other times, let's say, by figures like Abram Terz or Marina Tsvetaeva, the fact that he combines different ethnicities into himself can be seen as what makes him unique or generative, or sort of. And there's this extraordinary book called Under the Sky of My Africa, which is a compendium really of put together by Catherine Nepomniachtchi, that really is a sort of survey of the different ways that Russian figures have or let's say, or writers in Russian and thinkers in Russian have created images of Pushkin over time. And so you really can track just different, let's say, images of Pushkin over various decades as he gets embraced, adopted, co-opted, or celebrated for various reasons. And this is one let's say, theme within that story that that volume really puts together really well. And then I'll just say, like, it's very interesting, because reading now about the American reception of him, you can see various figures like Henry Louis Gates, who's an extraordinary historian of African American or Black American literature, wrote the introduction to that. And because of that volume, then other figures like Kwame Appiah, a major philosopher, also writes about Pushkin. And so every kind of moment creates another story. And then sometimes it's not just Pushkin himself, but let's say Eugene Onegin becomes the model for other sorts of writing. And so Vikram Seth's The Golden Gate Bridge, I think, is a way in which Pushkin has an even larger impact on world literature. So it's a kind of remarkable network or spread of his influence, the ways in which he serves as a kind of like a really incredible model for new aesthetic creation or new kind of ethnic transatlantic ethnic stories to emerge.
What is the Golden Gate Bridge?
I think it's called that. It's a novel in verse. I think I might not have the title correct, but it's by Vikram Seth. And so it uses the Onegin stanza as its form to tell its own sort of story.
Cool.
Yeah.
And so this leads me to the question then about the center at Amherst, or the project, the Soviet and Russian Injustice Initiative. So what is that, and how is Pushkin involved?
Yeah, thanks. So that project was inspired by a remarkable, I think he's a curator and conceptual artist, Yevgeny Fix, who created a traveling exhibition called the Wayland Rudd exhibition. And Rudd was a Black American who left the United States in the 1930s for the Soviet Union, holding out when it held out the promise as a kind of land of greater possibilities for American minorities, in particular Black Americans escaping the Jim Crow South and racism in the United States. So this project then sort of inspired us to think about the different ways where the Soviet Union either focused on racism in the United States as a topic, and in which you could see in a film like Alexandrov's film Circus or Cirque, but also where they did a lot of publications. So when, for example, W.E.B. Du Bois, the great Black thinker, travels to the Soviet Union in the, I think in the 1950s maybe, or 30s, then also figures beginning in the 1920s like Claude McKay, who was a Black American writer who wrote various accounts of his experience in the Soviet Union. So the project is really to collect the writings of a lot of Black Americans who traveled there or wrote and published there, as well as to really think about the long and complex entanglement between the Soviet Union and the United States, really precisely over the status of the racism within the United States, and how this particular story was really central. I'll just add one quick note, which was that in Brown v. Board of Education, one of the reasons why the Attorney General cites as a reason why we have to get rid of segregation in the United States was precisely because the Soviet Union was putting out so much, let's say, propaganda about this, about what was happening in the United States, and it was cited really as a reason why the standing of the United States was being seen as really quite hypocritical. And so there are all of these stories where this, the complex relationship between the two plays out really even in the story of civil liberties in the United States. That's actually something that is really interesting to the students, which is that how a kind of geopolitical tensions can really impact the laws or jurisprudence within our respective countries.
Yeah, that the ways in which American students react to Soviet propaganda, I think that's very interesting. Do you have an opportunity to share with them, besides movies, news broadcasts, or other propaganda methods that really shine a light on American racism, and how do they respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, so what this project also does is it collects posters, it collects books. We're particularly interested in children's books because that's one of the main areas in which you see this, and it's something that our Russian language students are able to read in the original and to study. So kind of the different representations of race that you see also in different forms of literature, and also for very different audiences. And so one of the, I think, quintessential responses is this seems so. So one thing we have them do is we have them read different historical accounts of this kind of this history or this entanglement. And then they will often say, but this is propaganda and it's terrible, right? And we say, yes, but it had a kind of beneficial function. And so it allows them to understand kind of the ambivalent or complex stories you can also tell about propaganda and how it can function or play out in different contexts.
But my sense is that, you know, our country has changed and we're much more aware of our history on this subject. Do your students see this propaganda and sometimes say, yeah, that's how it was and it's true?
Yeah, they see that, and they also see that a particular poster could be relevant even now, as you know, as we again see different just a kind of ongoing and chronic story about racism in the United States. And so, what I think is really powerful and saddening and moving for them is both the ways in which we take measure of have things improved, or are they the same, and one way to do so is to think about how some of these very iconic Soviet propaganda posters could be reprinted and put up on a wall today, and it would still feel pretty resonant and relevant.
Cool. So what is the general assessment of your students, particularly the African American students, when looking at all of the experience in the 1930s, 40s, in the Soviet Union, of Americans, Black Americans going to the Soviet Union, I guess in the 20s and 30s to build this new utopia? What is the assessment now, 100 years later?
Yeah, so I have a couple of students who are actually working on this, who are writing theses, and they are really inspired by a lot of the studies that have come out already, and then they're focusing on sort of other stories that haven't really been told. First, I think many of them are fascinated to learn about a story about Black internationalism, and to think about the different ways in which let's say, to see a kind of experiences that extend outside of the borders of the United States. So often by looking at whether that story takes place in France or the Soviet Union, it often has this kind of, it's just like a new dimension to thinking about, let's say, African American history. And then the other thing that I think, so several of the students are tracking, let's say, different writers like James Patterson, who was a poet who himself was thinking about Pushkin and his poetry. So I have a student who is writing a very challenging topic about thinking about how this poet or this writer Patterson thinks about Pushkin as a kind of model for his own poetry. And then I have another student who is writing about the image of jazz as it plays out, you know, as sort of quintessential American form, but how it's received within the Soviet Union. And I think one thing that's always remarkable and fascinating for the students is just to think about certain kinds of experiences that might have seemed only bounded by American, the confines of America, but then take place within totally different geographies or chronologies, and then they get played out that way.
I mean, like the existence of jazz and jazz club across Russia.
Totally, yeah, that, and or even So in this particular case, with Patterson, the way in which he works and writes within the Soviet Union and then recuperates the story also of Pushkin. Mm-hmm. And then that story in turn, in a way, needs to be recuperated by a scholar now. And so there is like a real sense about both the excavation and preservation of stories that many people didn't know. So I think it's really moving and challenging for the students.
That's awesome. It's great to hear that they're so engaged in these deep topics that connect both Russian history and American history. What What is the impression of your students of the Soviet period? Because they, of course, don't know it, they don't remember it. But do you still in your courses divide things between Soviet period and Russia, or is that sort of like do you have to discuss differences between Soviet culture, Russian culture? Like how does that come up now?
Yeah, that's maybe one of the major, I think, challenges of, and it's a kind of fascinating one. It definitely is something that is now treated really as a kind of historical, a civilization that is both near and incredibly far. I have a colleague who was just saying that she finds it incredibly difficult to even teach the 1980s and 1970s of the Soviet Union, that it seems so, in a way, completely alien, even if it might be the closest to us. And so I think one thing that a lot of people who teach the period are trying to do is how to really to think about how to teach it. There's a new book called The Soviet Century, Archaeology of a Lost World. And it does feel almost like you have to teach it as if it is a completed civilization that you, like almost like it's alien from us. But at the same time, figuring out what the differences are between the post-Soviet, and now Russia is one thing that a lot of scholars are actively working on. And I, because of my focus, which is really on the 1920s and really the 1920s, teach sort of the classic thing of this particular moment of great utopian experiment and energy.
Great. That's fascinating. I also think that the 70s and the 80s in the Soviet Union, the way your colleague expressed it, it's exactly right. It seems so close. I mean, it wasn't that long ago, but yet it's so different from what we see now. And it's almost easier to imagine and understand the black and white period of the Soviet Union than that grainy period of the 70s and 80s where everything was just so different than it is now.
Yeah, I think that there are a lot of remarkable scholars right now and cultural, just a range of people trying to really capture the nuances of that period, and to help us think about how to almost preserve the differences in order to teach it. And
Perfect. That's great. Monuments. So I know that you have a course this semester called Monuments For and Against.
Yeah.
Which I think is an interesting title. I suppose you mean for and against particular monuments, not just monuments in general. What is this course about?
Yeah, so the course is about the politics, the aesthetics, the culture of monuments, how at different times they become the focus of a range of debates, political debates, cultural hopes and anguish, anger. It's inspired in part by the recent upsurge of focus on Confederate monuments in the South. But I thought that one thing to do is, again, in a hope of thinking about how Russia and the Soviet Union can serve as a model or a counter model to think about monuments and the history of monuments, that by studying it, we can think about how cultures over time have really thought about why do you build a monument, and then what do you do with them as history moves or periods move or regimes change. And so the course is really, it focuses on anything from Pushkin, monuments of Pushkin, or monuments of Lenin. And it also focuses on things like Petersburg itself as a kind of monumental city, and just a whole array of monumental projects that are then juxtaposed with questions about, questions like what is to be done with monuments, and all of the different sort of repertoires of dealing with monumental forms that we see really after the collapse of the Soviet Union, for example, but also after 1917. And you just see all of these different ways that people either erect monuments or topple them. And sometimes it's a total against. So, for example, the avant-garde was really opposed to certain kinds of monumental forms because they thought that they were too static. But it's also a period that sees kind of like just radical monumental aspirations.
So what are some examples of what are some case studies of monuments in Russia right now that you're planning to discuss with your students?
Yeah, so to begin, or to go back to Pushkin, so one thing that the class begins with is a reading of, we read The Bronze Horseman, and we think about we think about different ways in which Petersburg and Peter became a monumental city or had monumental aspirations, and then what that kind of concept of monumentality means for either the so-called little person in Russia, but also other themes like iconoclasm, themes about idolatry, and so it touches on different levels, and it's a great work that helps students understand all of the different ways that you could think about a monument and relate to it. And then Pushkin himself, as he becomes monumentalized or memorialized, then is another unit where we think about, let's say, the creation of the Pushkin monument, and then in 1880, and then Dostoevsky's let's say writings about that particular statue, and then how it carries out over time. And since Pushkin himself wrote a poem about exegi monumentum, right, about this kind of creation of a literary monument, we also think about his status over time. There's other ones about thinking actually about the Belomor Canal as itself a kind of monumental project. So it thinks about monuments in a lot of different ways. So that one is about monumentality and carceral or kind of prison structures. And then another classic example will be monuments in Tatlin's monument to the Third International, as so one of the great kind of monumental projects that in a way represents the Soviet avant-garde's rethinking of monuments, and also the competition about different ways of thinking what monuments can do for culture and for politics.
Do you think, so going back to the monuments of the Pushkins and the Mayakovskys and all of the Russian greats who are on a pedestal, do you think Russians have a different relationship with monuments than Americans do?
I wish I could answer that at the end of teaching this class, since I'm going to teach it for the first time. I'll say what is maybe remarkable about the Russian or the Soviet case is how many times Russian or Soviet culture needs to deal with the creation or destruction of monuments, and how there is a kind of an extraordinary rich history of the dealing with it. So it is because of the kind of punctuated upheavals of Russian culture, and as well as its impact across a range of countries. You see it really having had experienced multiple times the question of what is to be done with monuments, and so I think it has it has really thought about this, and so one thing, for example, I'm going to teach the novel by Voinovich, Monumental Propaganda. Like, conceptual artists have had to really think about the legacy of monumentality in Soviet culture, and so you really see it as a persistent. I think maybe one thing I'll try to figure out the differences. I'm not sure you will invite me back, but I'll think about the differences. But one thing is that there is a kind of remarkable intensity and creativity about thinking about this question about what to do with monuments. And it animates a tremendous amount of Russian, Soviet, and post-Soviet, what we call cultural production and resistance and creativity around monuments.
It is remarkable, and I think that's one of the interesting things about how Americans have responded in recent years to our discussion around Confederate monuments. Because for once, Americans seem to care about the monuments that they're walking past every day.
Yeah.
And normally it's sort of a non-issue.
Yeah.
And as you said, in Russia, there have been all these periods where monuments go up, monuments come down, they go up, they go down. And a lot of that has happened in the 20th century, where there's film footage of, Tsarist emblems, toppling to the ground, and then, new Lenins being put up and then falling down. And that, in the US, we've, no one was documenting all of the English rulers who were being brought down when we declared independence. But it has happened in our history. But I don't think it's as much of it's not as much of as a big deal.
Yeah.
Even to the extent that you see, literary monuments in Russia with all of the roses and the school kids. It's just they're gathering points, and they're meaningful, and I think that's interesting.
Yeah, yeah. It's just a kind of remarkable and consistent theme and kind of cultural event to create it and then to topple it. But it's interesting. I was just at I saw an exhibition in Berlin that was also about how Germany is dealing with a lot of its own monuments and imperial monuments, but also monuments of Lenin. And so you see places where the kind of ongoing grappling with history and its and the artifacts of different historical periods, like they are continually kind of thinking about that and then how to display it. And so there was an example there of a Lenin that had been dismantled, then buried, and then excavated, and now exhibited. And each of those stages is something that I really want the students to understand that in the course, that this is a kind of thing that many places have experienced, and that a lot of curators and artists are themselves thinking about what to do.
I'm reading some of the questions that have come in. I do want to ask you though about the monuments, today's monuments to the Gulag, and your work on the canal, the Belomor canal, and your trip to Solovki. Talk about those monuments and those standing, memorials to Russian history.
Yeah, so I was, I think about 23 years ago now, I went on an excavation or a sort of expedition to the Belomor Canal that really traversed the entire canal and all of its locks, and then up to Solovki. And so what was sort of striking about that is the different ways in which certain histories are either so first, that entire canal project as itself a sort of monumental undertaking, as a sort of monumental monumental construction project that was supposed to symbolize the kind of might of and modernity of the Soviet Union or its modernizing hopes, but then is enabled by Gulag, or created out of Gulag labor, and then the different sorts of stories around memorialization that you can tell about it. So from anything from Solzhenitsyn to the work of contemporary memorial sort of workers who or scholars who try to think about the kinds of memorials that you can build around it. And so, but many of the sites are actually in total disrepair. Like it is not actually a full site of memorialization. And in part it's because they are so deep into the forests. So anyway, it's an extraordinary kind of site because it is also one that you can tell sort of stories of monumentalization and memorialization as regimes rise and fall. And then Solovki itself, which is where the expedition went, is another remarkable place, both beautiful and terrifying because of its multiple histories, where you see the different attempts to memorialize different historical moments.
So what is there now at Solovki? Describe that.
Well, I haven't been there. So when it was there, it was actually sort of just taking off. Like they wanted to create a memorial to the site itself as a gulag, or a site of the gulag. And so they were, at that point, they were just thinking about the different kinds of ways of marking it. But it was interesting because it was 2001, it was still a site that was sort of in transition. And so there were attempts both to recreate it as a monastery, but also to memorialize what had happened. So I think Simon Schama, the historian, has this story about how these are all the kinds of raw and chafing histories that various places can put forward. And this was a particularly raw and chafing one because the memorialization hadn't been completed, but it was also being reconstructed simultaneously.
So that it's interesting that there's this relationship between the church, rebuilding a monastery, and then the gulag that existed there. What is your impression about that kind of, sort of that Russian history that sort of blends the religion and the culture and these, northern, gulag, camps?
Yeah. It was a remarkable trip because we were there with a historian, Karl Schlogel, and he's the one that wrote this book, The Soviet Century. And he remarked, because he was giving a series of, we were just having informal conversations where the question really there that he posed was, what sort of chapter of history gets to take precedence, and how do you decide whether, for however long, let's say 400 years of one story, and then an episode within it, however terrifying and horrible, like how do you mark the balance between that? And I think that's what is perennially something that people try to work out, like how do you put forward or memorialize a moment that is transformative and highly disruptive to the history of a place, and then how do you even sometimes try to resist the longer history hiding those sorts of moments. Anyway, so I don't have a prescription about that, but I know that's kind of something that we're always trying to balance.
Does he address that in his book?
No,
The Soviet Century?
No, but I should write to him and ask him to.
Yes.
Yeah.
Someone has submitted a question and asked for you to recommend the top books about Russian culture or literature written by American Russian studies professors. And who do you like? So if you have any off the top of your head.
Oh, like of Pushkin or of
not of just of it, just the best books about Russian culture or literature,
Well, I think there's some. Yeah, I mean, I think this book by Schlogel is really fascinating. His name is Schlogel, Karl, The Soviet Century. Then Yuri Sloskin's
House of the Government.
House of the Government. Thank you. And then there's a remarkable book recently by Maria Stepanova, Memory of Memory. I think my professor Irina Perperno has written a remarkable book on the Soviet experience, or diaries of the Soviet experience. I don't know. This is a very difficult.
I know.
Yeah.
There's so much. By the way, I'm writing these down too. So whoever asked that question, I'm very thankful. I think the book that you said you're going to teach in your monuments course, the Monumental Propaganda, I have it. I haven't read it yet.
Yeah.
But I mean, I have a lot of books.
That one is amazing because it does that great job of sort of indicating how the desire for monuments and the complex relationships that characters can have to power. So I think it'll be illuminating for the students.
When I was working on that documentary about Pushkin, I met with the sculptor in Moscow, Alexander Burganov, and I remember there were a couple interesting exchanges with him. One, he talked about because I asked him, I was like, why are there so many Pushkin monuments across Russia? And he said, "Oh, we were always being asked to build monuments and statues, and nobody really cared. But whenever they would ask for us to build a Pushkin they'd be like, "Oh, great! When can we start?" Like there was enthusiasm about the Pushkin monuments, and then he turned it around on me and said, "Well, aren't you the same way with like Lincoln?" And I said, "No, I don't think that Americans get that excited about a monument to Lincoln,
Yeah.
except for maybe the one here in Washington. But it is a very different culture. So I'm anxious to read that book. One thing that we haven't talked about too much, and we have a question about, and I did want to ask you about, is film, because you also teach Russian language, you teach Russian and Soviet film, and this question is one of the same question I had for you, which is, what are the top Soviet and Russian movies for American students? What do they love?
Yeah. So that is also challenging, but I would say that so one thing that this class, let's say, was I'm teaching a survey of Russian and Soviet cinema, and we are focusing a lot on the early period. So they tend to. So it depends like what kind of major you are. If you're a film major, you tend to love things like Dziga Vertov, and really think about all of the different ways in which he innovated film form. We focus as well on something, and yeah, I mean the greats of Ivan the Terrible or anything by Eisenstein, which is sort of the period that I tend to work and write on. Recently, I have a set of students who are really into films from the 60s and 70s, and they are really fascinated by comedies and how, and all of that. And so they routinely come into my office and say, "Oh, we've just watched, Brilliantovaya Ruka," and just like totally love it. So it kind of changes from, I would say, it sort of depends on what kind of major is coming to talk to me about which one they love, and then they still tend to kind of very fascinatingly love things like Tarkovsky's Zerkala, of course, or Andrei Rublev. It really is a mix.
Yeah, and I think you brought up the film majors who are interested in Eisenstein and probably Tarkovsky as well, and because they're tall. We have a question here. You mentioned your students' interest in how Russian cinema has influenced international cinema as a whole. Can you elaborate on this?
Yes. So one thing that the course does is to, for example, it thinks about the different ways that techniques that are typically associated with the so-called Soviet cinematic avant-garde of the 20s and 30s really travel, and that can be anything from sort of different techniques around montage, the way in which an interest in documentary cinema, which develops in the 1920s, let's say, I mean, the Soviet interest in documentary, how that gets picked up later in France by figures like Chris Marker. So it's really kind of tracing the different sorts of threads. And then, of course, Soviet cinema also gets resisted in the 1960s and 70s. So we also think about the ways that, let's say, montage gets rejected, even by figures like Tarkovsky, but also other cinema makers in France. And we think about the different ways in which cinematic forms both travel, influence, and then get resisted in the overall course of cinema history.
Resisted? Why? Why was there a backlash?
So montage, for example, gets seen really as too ideologically, for lack of a better word, sort of heavy-handed, and so, but that's that's one camp, and then, but other aspects get picked up. So an interest in how to think about documentary itself as a mode of innovation and relationship to reality, and so those are kind of some of the threads that get traced in this course.
What film do you like to teach the most? Like, well, what's your favorite Russian or Soviet film? I know that's a terrible question. But...
No, my absolute favorite.
Good, you have one.
I'm not going to list all obviously like the masterpieces, because I really love a film called Salt for Zvanetia by Kalatozov, Kalatozov is better known for things like the Chat Juravli, the cranes are flying, or even maybe I Am Cuba, Yo Soy Cuba. But he has a film called Salt for Zvanetia, or Jim Schwante, which is a film that's set up in the Caucasus Mountains. It is a absolutely remarkable avant-garde ethnography that captures all of the experiments, questions about race and difference, the energy and problems of the revolution and modernization. Anyway, that's a great one.
Do you teach that course?
Yes, I teach that film in as much as I can.
That's all. I think one of the subjects when you teach film, if I remember when we talked earlier, is about how race is depicted, in old Soviet films or in Russian films. Yeah. And is that an example of?
That is a great example because it brings together the classic Russian imperial story of the attempt to dominate the Caucasus, particularly the Caucasian highlanders, and then, but also how it then meets a kind of anti-imperial moment that is also a moment of high cinematic experiment.
I have one more question before we go. One of the things that's been so interesting, Michael, talking to you is you have experience and interest in so many different aspects of Russian culture, from teaching the language to literature and film. And one thing we didn't talk about yet, but I want to ask you about is cave carvings. Yeah. And I think you're working on you've been working on researching this project. Can you tell us a little bit about this completely different topic than what we've been talking about today?
Sure. So that I'm writing a book about the Soviet interest in the 60s and 70s, to go back to this idea that it's quite a challenging period to think and write about the interest that emerges then in prehistory and prehistoric artifacts that are found within the territories of the Soviet Union. And so it's a kind of fascinating history where, for example, they discover cave paintings in the Ural Mountains that are called Naskalnaya Zhivopis, and why, for example, the Soviet Union really wanted an example of this, in part to compete with France. And and then it traces other things about different sorts of ways in which, let's say, the semiotic school of Moscow Tartu becomes really interested in the first kinds of forms of sign making. It's interested. So anyway, the book covers a lot of different ways. It also covers novelists who are interested in prehistory, and then I'll just note that one of the is that what's fascinating is that prehistory is a kind of zone of Cold War competition between the Soviet Union and the West over who could best understand prehistoric artifacts and how to decipher them. But it's also a place of major cooperation, as you see a lot of interactions at international conferences where people are really working together to understand kind of this remarkable set of objects and how difficult it is to place them within a story of the human or of history.
So am I understanding this as cave paintings were discovered in the Urals in the 60s?
Yeah, kind of. This one, 1959, and then yeah.
And then that sort of that allowed the Soviet Union to say, "Hey, we have these prehistoric, examples of art as well, and so we can participate in this."
Exactly, to participate in the earliest stories of the human, and so what happens that's sort of fascinating there is when that discovery is made, there is a very famous French prehistorian who says there's this extraordinary discovery that shows the extent of European cave painting. Then another debate emerges that says, no, this isn't European, it's kind of either Eurasian or it's something else. And then so it's basically a kind of story about the different ways in which you tell a story of the human, and I think this verb that you've just who gets to participate in the discovery and narrating of that history. And so it's a kind of fascinating story.
That is fascinating, and it's happening at the same time when the Soviet Union and America are both participating in the space race. You know,
Yeah.
so from cave paintings, prehistoric cave paintings, and landing on the moon.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like a time in which the deep future and the deep past are both sites of competition, but also of cooperation.
We have another question. I know we're at time, but this is a great question. You were talking about how challenging it is to explore Soviet history in the 70s and 80s. And this person asks, but what about the perestroika period, which of course is, late 80s? Is it more interesting or not for students or for professors? So is perestroika, is that separate from the Soviet Union of the 70s and 80s, or does that period sort of blend with the 80s and make it more or less interesting to students?
I think I'll just say, I think one of the challenges is always how to give some kind of distinctive account or shape to particular periods, and to figure out the ways in which they are unique, or certain tendencies kind of continue within them. I am not a good enough, let's say, scholar of that period to give you how to tell an account of it, and so I think I will defer that question. I'll just say mostly that I think that's kind of the great challenge. And so for me in my own courses, it's to say, what's particularly unique about this film at a particular moment, and then how do I try to figure out for myself, and then in an effort to explain to the students what are the unique features of that particular moment. And so that's kind of why it's always a kind of fascinating challenge, because these are periods that people are really actively writing about, and so trying to keep up both with the political history, the history, and the cultural history, but also what happens to the arts during those are what makes these classes really challenging to get a handle on.
Sure. And I'm thinking about your film classes. I mean, so many interesting films came out during the perestroika period.
Yeah.
Is that a part of your course ever, or did you focus mainly on the early Soviet period?
No, it's definitely becoming more and more into focus, and I'm trying to really think about, you get 28 films, or you meet 28 times, so you have roughly 28 films, and the question is how do you tell a story about Russian and Soviet cinema, but also certainly now the cinemas of the republics, Ukrainian cinema. I mean, it's a kind of general thing about how do you weave together a coherent sort of narrative or story that demonstrates the phases of cinematic development, and that's kind of what I'm sort of figuring out right now.
Great. I just wondered, do your students, do they tend to? I think it's fascinating that you said you have students now who love those Soviet comedies from the 60s and 70s. I was gonna ask you that question, because I mean they're so fun to watch, and I wondered if they resonate with American college students today. And it sounds like they do.
Yeah, they love. I mean, it's remarkable love for them. Yeah, for sure.
Do you use them in your language courses?
In the language classes, definitely. So we often, there are these great textbooks where you teach something like Autumn Marathon, Asini Marathon, and then it becomes like a great basis for conversation courses. So yeah, we teach them pretty frequently in those classes, along with, of course, things like Yojik v Tumanie.
Yes, that one I remember.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Michael, for joining us today. This has been interesting. It's great to hear that. I think colleges all across America are experiencing these really wide-eyed, interested students who are absorbing Russian culture and are interested in film and language and literature. And so thank you for bringing that to our students, and thanks for joining us today, and appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you for joining.
Yeah.